Do you struggle with impulse spending? That's something that I struggled with a lot when my mental health was not doing particularly well. And in the last couple of years, I've got it pretty much under control. So in this video, we're gonna go over my biggest tips for how to control that impulse spending. Hi, I'm Bear Money Coach. Thanks for coming to my channel where we pretty much talk about all things money. This week we're going to be talking about impulse spending and how to stop doing it. But before we get to it, be sure to hit like, be sure to hit subscribe. It helps my channel grow significantly. Now let's start off this video with just getting on the same page. So if you are struggling with impulse spending, I just want you to know that it's normal. It's just another coping mechanism that we all use on occasion to basically try and feel a different way than what we're feeling. We all have different coping mechanisms out there, whether they're good coping mechanisms or whether they're bad coping mechanisms, and there's nothing inherently good or bad about it necessarily. What can become bad about it is when you're impulse spending to the point where you're not able to pay the bills anymore, or in my case, you're not able to pay rent and you start to have panic attacks on how you're going to pay rent. But if you are struggling with it, know that you're not alone, and there are ways to really replace the impulse spending with other coping mechanisms. So we're going to talk about a few ways to do that. But let me level the playing field and explain to you what my experience was with impulse spending. So in my early 20s, I struggled really hard with depression and anxiety, and there were very few things that ever made me feel better, but spending money was one of the things that for some reason always made me feel better. And I think the real reason why spending money made me feel better is because the ultimate goal in any of my coping behaviors back then was to feel a different way than what I was feeling in that moment. And with spending, with drinking, with eating, things like that, I was able to tell myself that, well, if I do this, then next time I won't do it again. Or if I do this, this is gonna change X, Y, Z. Or if I do this, this is gonna happen. I would just kind of convince myself that this was the one thing that I needed in that moment to improve my situation. Obviously, it never was, and ultimately it ended up making my situations usually a lot worse, because not only would I be anxious and depressed already as a baseline, but then not being able to pay the bills, wondering how I was going to cover rent, not sure if I was going to be able to cover electricity and things like that, stressed me out even more, which just kind of kept me in that cycle. What we want to do is we want to figure out healthy coping mechanisms to help get us out of that cycle, because at the end of the day, if our coping mechanisms are actually hurting more than helping, well, it's going to be really difficult for us to get out of that cycle. So let's dive into my biggest tips and what helped me when I was dealing with emotional spending. So the very first thing that I recommend doing is create a list of all of the things that you do that make you feel good, make you feel better. Now, if you're so depressed right now or so anxious or in such a dark place that you cannot think of one thing that makes you feel good, try to think about what used to make you feel good before feeling what you're feeling now and going through what you're going now. The list can include anything. So it could be, I like taking Logan out for walks, or I like just, rolling around on my foam roller, or cleaning, or doing some art, or going for a run. What are those things that make you feel better, or at least feel differently? Make a big long list and put it somewhere that you know you'll have easy access to, whether in the notes app on your phone or whether just in your journal. Then, when you are in the moment where you are feeling this impulse to spend, I want you to go back to that list. So go back to the list and check one of those things and pick one and decide to do it for 15 minutes to an hour. The more time that you can put in between the impulse to purchase and the actual purchase, the better off you're gonna be. But the idea behind picking something off of that list is we created a list that contains all the different things that you can do that make you feel better. So let's say you're in that moment where you're wanting to impulse spend, and instead you decide, you know what, I'm gonna set the timer and I'm gonna go clean my apartment for the next 15 minutes. And if at the end of that 15 minutes, when that timer goes off, if you still wanna purchase the thing, go for it. But if you're like, Chloe, I can't do an hour, I can't do 2 hours, can you do that 15 minutes? Can you do 5 minutes? Can you start to increase the time between when you have the impulse and when you actually decide to pull the trigger? That's the key thing. We want to create space between the thought and the action. And if you're even able to squeeze 15 minutes in between there, it's going to slowly help make the difference in your go-to response. Because most of the time, like I said, when we're in that moment of wanting to do some kind of impulse spending, usually there's a feeling behind it. And for me, my feeling was always, I wanted to feel differently. I wanted that spark of dopamine or serotonin. I wanted something that would like give me hope that things would be different, even though most of the time it was just putting me further into the dark place that I was in. Another tip is in those moments where you are having that impulse, ask yourself, what am I feeling? What is the feeling here that I am trying to change? If you pause and ask yourself that question, you'll be able to start recognizing a pattern for what triggers you. And identifying the triggers is going to help prevent you from going into those triggers, or just recognize I'm triggered right now and I need to go back to my list to find something else that's going to make me feel better. Now, another reason that people tend to impulse spend is if their budget is too restrictive or too rigid. What I have found is very similar to the dieting world, is if you are restricting too much, eventually you get to the point where you're just going to binge. You're going to go eat all of the food, or you're gonna go spend all of the money. This used to be me to a T, again, in my early 20s, and honestly, even before that, where I'd get really good at spending months being very, very strict with my money, only to eventually pop and like spend like a crazy woman on stuff that I didn't even really care about. If you're able to create those splurges or include the things that are important to you inside of the budget, then you're probably not going to have these intense feelings of needing to binge if you already treat yourself on a weekly basis. Because ultimately at the end of the day, our budget is not supposed to be a practice in self-deprivation and be a miserable thing. It's supposed to be a tool to help you live the life you want to live, which living the life I want to live means spending my money on things that actually bring me value. So if you find that impulse spending is happening on a weekly or monthly or bi-weekly basis, maybe you want to take a look at your budget. Are you doing something that's creating an environment where you feel this need to spend? I always recommend identifying the things that are really important to you that you want your money to be going to. So for me, that is travel, that's a little bit of eating out, that's, massages and things within my health and fitness routines that I make space in the budget for, because those things are important to me. And at the end of the day, I don't want to swipe and cut out everything that brings me joy in my life on this journey towards financial freedom, because at the end of the day, financial freedom, building wealth, all of it takes time, and we want to be in the race for the long term. Now, this brings me to my next tip. If you know that you struggle with impulse spending and you know it's going to happen, why not just include it in the budget instead? So rather than just like hoping that somehow you're not going to do the impulse thing that you're doing, what if we just like made a budget for it? What if you decided every week I'm gonna allow myself to impulsively spend $100? Maybe that's controlling it a lot more than what you would have done had you not made a budget for it at all. There is nothing wrong with the actual action of impulse spending. It is only the fact that it can be a huge detriment to your financial goals. So if we are planning for the impulse spending, we are still working it into the budget and making sure we're on track for our financial goals. So really it becomes a very harmless thing. This can be a really good way to start tapering back on impulse spending, where you're giving yourself that permission that, okay, you know what, $100 a week or $100 a month or whatever it needs to be for you is what I'm gonna start with. And slowly over time, I'm gonna try and cut back to the point where I am not spending impulsively, I'm spending mindfully, and I'm spending in a way that brings me value and joy. And the final tip that I have for you is if there's a particular category of spending that you find to be the most difficult to control, maybe consider using cash for that category. So for example, let's say that beauty products are something that you find yourself impulsively purchasing in the middle of the night every night. What if you gave yourself a cash budget that you literally took out of the bank account and allowed yourself to spend that amount in whatever time frame that you're budgeting for? So the reason that this is good is because you can't online shop with cash. You also have to like go to a store in order to spend the cash. So that middle of the night splurge is not going to happen because you have to literally like get into your car and go to the store. And also there is a physical stop on when that cash is gone. Now, I am not somebody who believes in all cash budgets. I think generally those are really difficult to do in today's day and age. But doing it for the particular categories that you struggle with the most can be a really, really good way to start controlling that spending. Because you see this cash and once it's gone, you're done with that category. These tips can make a huge difference on your impulse spending over the long term. And if we're able to start doing it little by little, eventually you're going to get to a place where you don't struggle with impulse spending in the same way that you used to. For me, I really don't struggle with impulse spending at all. And if I even feel the need to start impulse spending, I just add something to my budget. So to me, if I'm adding it to the budget, it's not really impulse spending because I'm planning ahead for it. One of the most recent things that I did struggle with is I got into the habit of ordering too much DoorDash and Uber Eats and things like that. So I literally put on my calendar, and my assistant, who is also my sister, looked at my calendar and laughed at the fact that over the course of the month I had every single day, do not order DoorDash. And it was just this little extra reminder to me that I made a promise to myself that I wanted to get back on this, and I don't want to go against that. So let's recap the tips again. Number 1, make a list of the things that bring you joy, bring you value, change the way you feel, make you feel good, that does not involve spending, drinking, eating, or getting high. Number 2, set a timer. When you are experiencing the impulse urge, set a timer for 15 minutes to an hour. If you can work your way up to that hour, you're gonna be good. And then go pick something off of that list and do that until the timer goes off. Because remember, we're trying to create a buffer between when we have the thought and when we do the action. Number 3, ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What is the trigger that is making me want to do this impulse spending? This works because not only are you stopping yourself from the actual action, but you're addressing the root cause of what's actually making you want to spend. So ask yourself, what am I feeling? What is the trigger that causes this? Can I do something else that will make me feel better? Because at the end of the day, I know whatever I'm about to buy is probably not going to solve what I'm feeling. Number 4, look at if your budget is too rigid. If you are being way too strict, just like in the dieting world, then you are literally creating an environment where you're gonna want to binge on your spending. So make sure to incorporate that into the budget. Make sure the things that bring you joy and value are in the budget. Which leads us to the next tip, which is if you know you're going to impulse spend, put it in the budget. Who cares? I don't care as long as we're controlling it and we're being mindful of it. So if you know every week I need $100 of impulse spending, that is fine. Put it in the budget. And the next tip, use cash on the areas that really, really are tough for you. This will give you a very clear idea on when you need to stop, and it's just cash. You're gonna have to go to the store in order to do the impulse spending. You can't be doing that online. All right, so those are my impulse spending tips. I hope you found those helpful. Let me know if you have any really great impulse spending tips down in the comments below. And if you've made it this far and you haven't hit like and you haven't hit subscribe, why do you hate me? Just kidding. Hit like, hit subscribe. That helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate you for being here. So I will see you guys next week, and thanks again for watching.